Welcome back, everyone. I'm sure you share my excitement to dive back into today's enriching discussions. Before we proceed, let me remind you that we're offering simultaneously interpretation in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, both for in-person audience and our online viewers. So please select the language that suits you best. Now picture this: a knight, a lawyer, and two economists strolling into Knowledge Week. Wow, quite intriguing. It's not every day that we have the privilege of hosting such prominent figures, each at the top of their respective fields of investment, impact, evaluation, and research, gathered to explore avenues for promoting development effectiveness. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished guest, Sir Ronnie Cohen, President of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investments. I want to know if we have Sir Ronnie already. He's going to be connected with us. And Marie Gardner, Executive Director for the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, known as THREE. Carolina Trivelli, Senior Researcher at the Institute of Peruvian Studies. And steering our discussion, our moderator, Alexandre Meira da Rosa, General Manager of Strategic Planning and Development Effectiveness at the IDB. Let's show our appreciation for our guests.
Okay, can you hear me well? Yes? Great.
Yes.
Fantastic. So, look, as a development bank, development effectiveness is obviously at the very core of what we do. But as we also know as operators in our day-to-day lives, that getting to results is not always a straight line, right? So here, the idea of this panel today is to discuss with you how things like engagement with clients, knowledge generation, and cost-effective allocation of resources might help us in achieve greater development effectiveness. And for that, we have a high-level panel here representing the private sector, academia, think tanks, and also government experience to discuss with us issues like these key elements I just mentioned. And I'd like to start to use to make best use of our time with Sir Ronald, who is joining us from Israel. And Sir Ronald, I want to thank you again for your commitment to join us in these difficult times for the region, to talk a little bit on impact investment and strategies on how impact investment can align capital with development goals and also help in allocation of resources in an effective manner towards to development effectiveness. So, Sir Ronald, what is new in the impact investment industry? And your work you have written and talked a lot about that. What are strategies or instruments and views that you see new in that industry that you could share with us and help to build this vision for a strategy for MDBs?
Thank you, Alexandra, and it's wonderful to be here with you, with Marie, with Carolina, and all of you in the audience and online to talk about this very important subject. The novelty in financial markets, Alexander, is the arrival of pay-for-success financial instruments. The initial invention of the social impact bond, with which I was privileged to be involved in 2010, has led today to a $1.25 trillion sector of sustainability-linked bonds and loans. And these are basically bonds or loans where the interest payable by a borrowing company falls if the company achieves certain preset environmental or social targets. So for a pharmaceutical company, it might be the penetration of its drugs in vulnerable populations. For a company which is involved in electricity generation, it might be the reduction in its carbon emissions. This change away from just optimizing risk return to optimizing risk return and impact is a very significant change for all of us in this conversation today. The reason is that we've always had the ambition to achieve outcomes. And you were talking yourself, Alexandra, about being able to shorten the line to actually achieving outcomes. And the evidence that we see now in the United Kingdom, where there have been 90 outcomes partnerships so far, is that it costs half as much to deliver services through a pay-for-outcomes partnership as it does by simply paying for it. And it also, very importantly, opens the door to the generation of data as the delivery organizations seek to hit their targets. They generate a huge amount of data about what works and what doesn't work. And that informs political decision-making afterwards about the best ways of achieving development goals or dealing with social issues in more developed countries, or environmental issues as well. And so I think we're on the threshold of a new model now, where, like the Education Outcomes Fund, which I'm also privileged to chair, where we pool commitments to pay for outcomes when they have been achieved. So say in the area of education, the Education Outcomes Fund aspires to raise $1 billion of commitments and capital from local governments from national governments in Africa and the Middle East, as well as philanthropic and other donors, to pay for the outcomes through contracts that they sign with the delivery organizations, which are themselves funded by impact funds, which provide them with the investment capital to achieve their goals. So we have two programs now, one in Ghana, one in Sierra Leone, about $50 million of outcomes payments, targeting about 300,000 children. And you can see the results coming through. And I believe that this is a very significant innovation in the field. I'll stop there and very happy to go into greater detail in the course of our conversation.
Thank you very much, Sir Ronald, for your perspectives on what we call in the industry here among the MDBs, the results-based lending, and the potential that it offers as well in the impact investing industry. But I also want to shift gears a little bit to government. In your experience, Carolina, you as a former minister in Peru had the chance to be not only a policymaker, but I would say a driving force behind the use of evidence and of the importance of development effectiveness in government actions. And I, in my own experience here at the bank, and I'm sure that my colleagues will follow, is that despite the fact that we recognize very much the importance of clients' ownership, the challenge is to make sure that they understand the relevance of development effectiveness for their own policies and benefit, right? So in your experience, what are the elements, the key elements, to enable the involvement of different stakeholders, because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about, right, in government, into this development effectiveness agenda?
Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you to the bank for the invitation. My pleasure to be here. I think one of the key issues to really move to achieving development effectiveness is to ensure to the public servant, to the politician leading a ministry or an public agency, is to understand that what matters is the final result, and that also if you do your work perfectly, you will not be able to achieve it alone. So you need the others. And then you need to seek for the others. And I think there are 4 elements from my experience that work nicely to allow evidence-based process to achieve development effectiveness. First, you need a plan. And usually, we get this very thorough diagnostics where everybody finally convinced in what is the initial situation. We get a very nice view of the final result we want to achieve, but we don't pay much attention on what's in the middle, how we move from where we are to where we want to be. And having that sort of theory of change with a very diverse participation, it takes forever. It's very time-consuming. It's very difficult because you get into the discussions about who will do what and why you're not doing what you should be doing. But that's key. If you don't have that middle segment well developed, well understood, and with a solid agreement, and that means dealing with actors, understanding their relationships. And that's tough because you don't have the time. So, but that's something very needed. Second, you need leadership, as you were saying. You need a champion that builds the narrative and that calls everybody to get involved in this middle between the diagnostic and the outcome. But that champion, the main role for that champion is to build a coalition with the other actors, to involve the private sector, the academia from your country in that same objective. Because if you don't have a coalition, when you are removed from your position, then all the process goes to zero. So you need really not only the leadership to promote, engaging in one action, but building a coalition. The third element is you need very good instruments. And that's why we need good programs, good interventions, the right investments, payment for results, different types of ways of achieving things. But we usually spend too much time thinking about how to make perfect this instrument. And the second question is how we make this instrument work with this second instrument. Because for poverty alleviation, social exclusion, people need several things to happen at the same time if you really want to change the feasible options to engage in a sustained and sustainable way out of that condition. So instruments, yes, we need the best instruments, but what we need to have is sets of instruments, bundle of interventions that go all together, and that we know how to make them work together, and that's pretty difficult. And the fourth element, and I will stop there, is evaluations. And Michael Kramer was telling us about the importance of evaluations, but I would say that we need impact evaluations for sure, and I will end with that, but we need also other types of evaluations. Design evaluations, performance evaluations, ongoing evaluations throughout implementing innovations, through scaling pilots. And those are different types of evaluations, but we need to have them, all of these different evaluations, and all the time, throughout the whole process of any intervention we have. I will finish with this. Impact evaluations are key for sure to learn how to improve the process and how to enhance what we are already achieving, but also to protect this whole process. You know, usually when we get the results of an impact evaluation, we are in the middle of the implementation of this theory of change. We are not already where we want to be. So we need this impact evaluation to ensure us that we have enough evidence to support to keep implementing for a longer time these whatever instruments we're using to achieve the goals in the future.
Well, thank you, Carolina, and that raised to me 2 points. The first, with the risk of being self-centered, I would say that when I hear the 4 key points you raised, right? Having a plan, leadership, knowledge, and etc. I see the importance that institutions like IDB and other MDBs and think tanks as well can play into supporting that leadership, being that intertemporal bridge across governments on important policies, generating knowledge and distribute. That's what we're doing here today in a certain sense, right? And the second point, I think that the importance of knowledge is a great segue actually to the conversation that we want to have with Marie. Marie's work, both in academia and think tank, and she was just telling me here at the IDB as well. She's a former IDBer, therefore forever an IDBer, is to connect and facilitate and foster the use of knowledge in evidence-based decisions for greater development effectiveness. And lately, for some time now, Marie is heading the 3IE initiative. So I will start by asking Marie that you give us a brief overview of what 3IE is and what are your key objectives. And later tell us if you know institutions that manage to prioritize, institutionalize the creation and use of knowledge in project generation, monitoring, and evaluation.
Great, thank you. And thanks to IDB for this invitation. Excellent opportunity to be here as a forever IDBer, as you said. And so, yes, just a quick, very brief intro to 3IE. And it's basically that we are an international NGO dedicated to improving lives in lower middle-income countries, basically by ensuring that decision makers have access to, but also use appropriate, rigorous, and also relevant evidence to inform decisions, inform programs. And during our 15 years, this is our 15th anniversary this year, and during our 15 years of existence, we have done this, you know, in the early days by really contributing to an expanding body of evidence to draw on. So there's much more now than when we started 15 years ago. But also by developing innovations and tools, such as some of you may have heard about our evidence gap maps that were developed by 3IE, producing systematic reviews that draw the body of evidence around impact evaluations on specific topics, and our development evidence portal that now have over 12,000 impact evaluations that are searchable online. And making this body of evidence really accessible and sort of readily digested and ready for decision makers. But we've seen an increasing need to focus on sort of the uptake and also the appropriate use of evidence, however. We don't see this existing evidence sufficiently used. And so there are many barriers to using existing evidence, even when accessible. And so we started a sort of a stock taking of seeing what are institutions like IDB, like FCDO, etc., what are they doing in terms of addressing these barriers. And so we developed iteratively a framework that we're calling TRIPS, It's developed sort of, based on seeing what these organizations are doing, and it stands for, TRIPS stands for training, resources, incentives, processes, and signals. Hopefully can go back into some of what the evaluation of these measures are showing, but typically they work as a whole. And what we're finding is that a holistic approach is required, and you need to sort of really pull on all these levers to ensure appropriate use of evidence. And so a bit back to your questions, Alexander, I think we've seen that a number of organizations are trying a number of things around these different levers. And so, for example, just this week, training, this Knowledge Week in IDB is an example of that. USAID had a learning month, I think it was in May, on resources. For example, recently the NORAD and the Norwegian Aid Cooperation and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway actually decided in their national budget for 2023 that it was in fact allowed and expected that you should use evidence to inform aid, and that evaluations were actually okay to use as part of your budget. And this was sort of as opposed to previously where one had to really sort of ask for an exception almost to do evaluation. On incentives, we see that, for example, the World Bank started making packages of existing evidence from their completion reports from existing impact evaluations, systematic reviews, available ahead of time when TTLs were starting a new project. So that's again, a good measure. And then on the processes, this is where we're seeing the most measures. Mm-hmm. I think IDB is has been very advanced with the development effectiveness framework. We have the Millennium Challenge Corporation that are setting ex-ante cost-benefit measures, so to speak, and expectations of internal rates of return of 14% or something before, as a requirement for approval. And then finally on signals, I think we've heard very clearly, for example, the IDB president setting now signals expectations from the top, and this also trickling down. So all of these are sort of measures taken by a number of organizations. I think back to your question, I think I haven't seen any organization that really truly addresses all of these levers holistically. I think maybe just to say that the closest that and I know this organization slightly less well, at least not from the inside, is the Millennium Challenge Corporation that really has done what you talked about, Carolina, where, really ensuring that different types that you understand the whole project cycle, what are the touch points through that cycle that require evidence, which different types of evidence are those, and then also putting funds aside. 1.5% of their budget is set aside for research and evaluation. And then they're also basically making all of their projects are being evaluated, 40% of them impact evaluations, all of it made public, data made transparently available, scrutinizable. And then, very importantly, MCC has been able to sustain sort of an internal culture and also provide signals from leadership that using evidence throughout is important for development effectiveness. This has been very important. For example, Alicia Phillips Mandeville, Vice President of the Department of Policy and Evaluation at MCC, has very much been signaling this and will actually be joining President Goldfein on Friday, as well as 3IE and a few other organizations, signing a commitment to evidence. So yeah, I think to say there's a lot of promising initiatives, but sort of really this holistic approach is something that I still believe we need to see more of.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Marie, and I think that this is a great wrap up actually to this first set of questions we had, because what we see is that, I would say also two things. The first is that allocations of resources towards development in an effective manner, we have experience that goes across the whole public-private spectrum. This is not a monopoly of public agencies or governments at all. There's a lot on the private sector that are actually pushing the envelope on that area. And the second is essentially what you've called in a holistic approach, is that development effectiveness is a multifaceted issue, right? That has many dimensions, and that has to be approached from an institution like ours, from the entire project cycle. And the project cycle does not begin necessarily at the project design, right? The project cycle begins also at project selection, at the dialogue with the countries, at selecting those areas and projects where we have a highest probability of having a higher impact at the end of the cycle. But entails, again, as Marie put it very well, the need to generate knowledge and evaluations throughout every single part of the cycle, and a commitment that takes the entire organization, right? That's why we're starting at SPD a campaign that development effectiveness is everybody's business, right? It's not only SPD or a number of people, or DSP in the case of IDB Invest issue. It's an issue that touches everyone in every part of our work. With that, maybe Maria, taking the benefits that you are, the floor is still yours. What are the barriers that you see? You said that you have not seen any institution that have tackled that entirely, right? So what are the barriers that you see to implement a robust knowledge management and knowledge and evidence application in organizations like ours?
Yeah, so, and in some previous hats I've had as well, I've had the opportunity to carry out evaluations of both the World Bank's approach to learning and NORAD's approach to learning, and I'm familiar with other evaluations done over the last 8 years, and I think they're still relevant because there's evidence to show that institutional change takes on average 11 years, so I think eight years is fine. And they are basically come a lot to the same conclusions that, for some of you were around at the time or know about it. The Wappenham's report from 1992 at the World Bank was sort of seminal and basically talked about approval culture crowding out learning. And that is something that still comes out in several of these recent evaluations. And so there seems to still be an inadequate institutional incentives, insufficient and inconsistent signals and role modeling from the top of the organizations, that learning and evidence use are really important. Often, success is often measured by project approvals and disbursements of funds. Not so much by results on the ground, which, by the way, usually happen when staff have moved on. And similarly, sort of quality review and approval meetings, often do not add sufficient value, but sort of have a sense of waving things through, and there's a bit of a ticking the boxes mindset to them. And finally, time and resources for monitoring and evaluation, training and learning from evidence are often not prioritized. So these are some of the findings. And what we've seen is that sort of, if, for example, if you only do the procedures part, let's say you will require that evidence is used at the entry point when deciding on projects. Well, if you haven't worked on the other, on incentives and for example, and so on, then typically you will see that it's not necessarily the best evidence that is used. It is more sort of the other way around. You're finding the evidence that suits the design you already had in mind. And so So we talked about the TRIPS levers again, and I think on the sort of processes and requirements is where we made the most progress. I think signals is something that we are currently seeing quite a lot of interesting signals from the top of various development institutions, really taking development effectiveness seriously. Not everywhere, but I think increasingly. Where I think the biggest challenges lie are some around training. I think there's a need for more training, not only about how to do impact evaluations or how to do other types of evaluations, but really about asking the questions, like how do I know this? Or how does my senior actually know? Does this person know what they're doing, or am I just copy-pasting a program from previously? Really sort of the questioning mindset and understanding which decision points could be informed by evidence and training around that. Resources, I think there's still insufficient dedication to resources, and it's become sort of, it's not easy to get those resources. It's an additional hurdle. You have to go to trust funds, for example, to get funding. But the most important, the biggest hurdle, I think, is incentives. And that's the one the hardest to touch on. I think the biggest incentive of all is if the market demands excellent knowledge and sharing of best practices, etc. So creating a market for outcomes, in a sense. I've written a paper about this, and really sort of that's what the discussion should be. If the governments, like we talked about, can have that kind of conversations about what is it the government wants to achieve and how do we together achieve it, I think that's going to be a huge incentive for staff in all sorts of development organizations who are intrinsically motivated, by being in organizations that are mission-driven. So that's one. But I have a couple of others that I think are important. You have to make it easy to do the right thing. So rather than having to go to trust funds, etc., to do the right thing and the additional bureaucratic hurdles, can you make it, sort of an expected thing that you get access to funding to do evaluation? Can you make it easier to access existing evidence? A little, again, PR for 3IE. We have this development evidence portal. It is the largest of its kind in the world. It has over 12,000 impact evaluations. It's searchable. It has systematic reviews in there, and so on. But making these kind of tools available, and so on, and then make it easier to free up time potentially for project leads, for managers. And that's partly by looking at the bureaucratic processes of which add value and which are just box ticking. Again, I think it's important. Make it also easier and safe to share lessons. Adapt, pilot, take risks. I think we've heard from several and earlier this morning as well that's not this, that's important to take risks, but is that incentivized sufficiently in our organizations? And then reward staff for learning and knowledge sharing, sort of in promotions, performance reviews, etc. And don't penalize when projects fail, but just penalize if they keep doing, not learning the same lessons. I have a few more lessons, but I'll stop there because I know you.
Could I come in here, Alexander?
So Ronald, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this question of incentives that Marie highlighted, because I think that is the most important part of our conversation today. For me, making evidence accessible and evaluating impacts are bits of an engine. They're not an engine in themselves. They don't provide the incentives for it. They don't provide an incentive for people to achieve impacts or to do so in the best possible way. They provide very valuable components of an engine. And the engine is results-based funding. When you have results-based funding, it is based on evidence and it is based on evaluation. But you have very big incentives that unite the private sector, the public sector, the academics in the world, and social organizations. They each have a different incentive. The outcomes payer, and Marie, you referred to creating a market for outcomes. To have a market for outcomes, you need to have somebody who's buying them, not just somebody who's achieving them, right? And so if you create an outcomes fund for any issue that we think is crucially important for us, you create a market, precisely that. You even create price discovery in that market by having investors and social sector organizations or businesses that are prepared to try to achieve these outcomes and get paid for it and get remunerated for it if they invested in it. And so the power of results-based funding is that it unites all of the different sectors that we want to motivate through incentives in achieving the goal and getting remunerated for it, and you only get paid if you achieve the outcome. That is a huge discipline for the organizations delivering the services. So government is incentivized because it does it at half the cost of traditional fee for service. Investors are motivated and incentivized because they get both a financial and a social return. The organizations using the investment capital in these outcomes partnerships have contracts that give them a business model, enable them to achieve revenues if they hit targets in education or in any other field. And so when you begin to think in terms of outcomes partnerships, you use the power of evidence and you use the power of evaluation in order to be able to create these incentives to create a marketplace, precisely as Marie described.
So Ronald, taking the opportunity that you have the floor in this very interesting construction you made on showing how results-based funding or results-based lending align those incentives at the different levels, across different stakeholders and across different levels. My question to you is that anything that governments or regulatory bodies could do to facilitate and even incentivize these markets, right? In the case of the private results-based lenders or funders?
Sure. I mean, what we found very interesting of the Education Outcomes Fund is that in both Ghana and Sierra Leone, the government said we are prepared to put 15% of the money up for the Outcomes Fund, okay? And they can house the teams that are working on the ground. The evidence that is being generated is open source. They have access to it, so they're very strongly incentivized to get involved. And the Ghanaian government actually said, if you're not going to do this, we're going to do it anyway, because we believe this is the way forward. Now, the biggest thing today that is an obstacle, Alexander, isn't raising the investment capital. I mean, you know that from your own experience as a bank. There's lots of capital in different pots today that would like to achieve impact and a financial return. The difficulty is in putting the outcomes funding together. And that's where government has to play a role if we want to accelerate the increased effectiveness of development. We need governments to say, look, we have entities like US AID and others in the world that are capable of providing grant capital. That grant capital will go in commitments to outcomes funds, because those outcomes funds will prepare tariffs for educating or dealing with the health issues or whatever other social issue we're trying to tackle with specific populations. We may want to pay more for a young woman that gets educated than a young man, for somebody from a village than somebody from the city, from somebody who's disabled than somebody who's able-bodied. We can provide incentives, again, picking up Marie's point, for the organizations delivering the services to do so in the most effective way socially, not just the low-hanging fruit. When you have that expertise and you can sign contracts, it's easy for banks like UBS and impact venture organizations like Bridges Ventures to put together funds that fund these organizations seeking to receive the outcomes payments. So if in this conversation we can create a mechanism where governments are incentivized, begin to understand this, and we can go into the reasons why it hasn't happened faster, because there isn't yet the institutional readiness within government to change to these different ways of commissioning. So we have to incentivize government to go to these new ways of thinking, despite the inertia in the existing system. And the motivation for them should be, it's going to cost me half as much, and the quality of the services delivered are going to be superior, and the evidence is going to be superior and is going to help me in policy making, and everything will have been evaluated and audited to the highest professional standard. How we crack this depends on which government is going to take a bold step forward and which issue is going to be a high priority for that government. I'll close just by making a simple opportunity obvious to us all. At the G7, the recent G7, Japan launched a global impact investment health initiative. Let us focus on diabetes and malnutrition. Let us create outcomes funds to pay for improvements in the prevention of diabetes and malnutrition. They affect hundreds of millions of people across the world. Diabetes, about 800 million people. Malnutrition, 150 million children. And let us try to get our governments to make allocations to these outcomes funds, supported by international philanthropists and so on. And let us tackle these themes at scale, because we will prove that it is a better way to deliver. It opens the door to innovation instead of prescribing what needs to be done. It costs less and it delivers better outcomes.
Excellent. So Ronald, thank you for those points. And now maybe as we are talking about what governments could do, I'd like to explore more Carolina's experience in your life in government, right? And in what were the lessons you've learned in the obstacles you face, right? In trying to implement this development effectiveness focused policies, let's say, right? In what are the, I think I'm losing my mic here. In what would be the recommendations you'd have for policymakers trying to in the region, especially trying to engage in
yeah, well, there's
direction?
always a tension between what the more politically oriented champions have that what the more technical staff members want. So there's a tension there, and we need to acknowledge that. But I would summarize this in around 6 insights I learned through my past through the public sector. First, the goal, the results must be doable. Because you go and tell the president, we are thinking about implementing this program, and this will reach 100,000 early childhood children. You say, wow, 100,000, that's nothing. I can not do that. Say, no, we need to do it for 100,000 to prove that it can go to scale. They say, well, okay, let's do it. But there's a tension. The policy leader will want big numbers in short terms, and that doesn't work. That's not feasible. So there's a big trap there, and you need to deal with that. Second, it's better if it's not your idea. It's not something that you, as leader of one topic, issue, sector, discover. It's something that someone else already did, and you're bringing to your country, to your sector. We did Cuna Más, Caridad is here, an early childhood development program, and we got the idea from Jamaican experience. They did it in Jamaica. We're bringing and adapting that experience that was highly successful there to the public sector, to the Peruvian context, and to the characteristics of our sector, development and social inclusion. And that was very relevant to protect the program. It's not something that a great mind created within MIDIS, but we're bringing lessons from abroad. And that is a big tension, because if you have political intentions, you want the idea to be yours. But if you're a technician, it's a lot more safer to bring the idea from somewhere else. Third insight, well, evidence, use evidence, and the more international evidence is out there to support your initiative, the better. But you need to have access, and that accessibility is not always that easy for public servants. Fourth, we need to understand that for several public servants, evaluations are a big threat. Because if the evaluation comes out saying that something went wrong, that means that you did wrong, that you misused public money, that you will be in trouble. So we need to deal with that tension, because if we don't change the mindset of what's the role of evaluation, saying that the good thing about finding that something was going wrong is that we will stop spending money in something that is not really bringing any results. So, but that has to be a mindset change in the public sector sphere. Sixth, you need to have interlinked work and coordination. And that sounds pretty easy. Let's agree on how we're going to do it, and let's do it. And you usually get nice agreements at the ministerial level or at the program leader levels. But then what you really need to have is instruments and incentives to allow the planning and budgeting officer from one sector to work in coordination with the planning and budget officer of another sector or of a different governmental level. And that is very difficult. We have very little experience on instruments that really achieve that. And that is the key to have good implementations. And the last one, insight I would like to share, is that evaluations are key, impact evaluations are key, but they need to be external, done by an independent body, and hopefully funded also by, not by the government. Because if it's also the Ministry of Finance that is pulling money to pay for the evaluation, then there's always the suspicious, is within your government, they are being nicer, this is not quite good. So it's tough, because it's easier to move money from the public budget for the evaluation, that having the money from the outside, but the impact of that evaluation results will be a lot better and a lot more protective of the process if it's paid independently too.
Excellent, Carolina. As we approach the last mile of our panel, what we saw in this last round of questions were an interesting discussion on how institutions, both on the public side and the private side, can institutionalize development effectiveness, right? And the challenges that we have, the many challenges that we have in doing so. But in Carolina's last intervention, she was telling about the importance of coordination, of intra-government coordination for those objectives to be achieved, right? To have effectiveness as a top priority. I would expand that and say that this is a mandate and a challenge as well on many different levels, right? It requires coordination between MDBs, it requires coordination between governments and the private sector, and that's what I would like to take this few minutes we have left with our panelists to explore. And then I'll pick on your brains, Sir Ronald, and what are the opportunities do you see for impact investors and development organizations like ours to collaborate more effectively to maximize our joint impact?
Thank you, Alexander. I think first of all, we have to recognize that there are changes in financial markets which make it easier for us to attract money from from investors who have a different set of considerations in their decision-making that include both profit and impact. So moving in the impact into the impact area through results-based funding, in particular, in my view, is capable of attracting a lot more funding than we have today within the development sector. Right, like $1.25 trillion of sustainability-linked bonds and loans, dwarfs the $150 billion a year spent by development organizations. It requires different skills, which I think a bank like IDB, working with outcomes funds like the Education Outcomes Funds and perhaps a Diabetes Outcomes Fund and the Malnutrition Outcomes Fund, whatever other a Green Transition Outcome Fund, if we can work together to establish these outcomes funds and begin to fund the organizations that can achieve the targets through investment that is based on being paid if the outcomes are achieved, we will shift to a new and more effective model, quite simply. The challenges in the way are, one, governments aren't used to commissioning for outcomes. They're used to putting people in competition for fee-for-service. Commissioning for outcomes, you have to trust people who are going to prepare tariffs within your government that are going to be right and pay according to them. You need a budgetary cycle which enables you to make commitments now for payments over 5, 6, 7, or 10 years instead of just an annual budget. And you need initiatives that lock in the program so that if there is a change of government, the program doesn't stop. And that's another big advantage of outcomes-based funding. The contracts are for 5, 7, 10 years. If we can work together to achieve that, we will help shift the paradigm now to achieve more effectiveness in development.
Thank you, Sir Ronald, and I couldn't agree more with your points. Carolina, I would like to hear your reflections on that, also on how we can coordinate among organizations. But what, as a policymaker, what was the value added that MDBs had for the clients, right? So how we can coordinate better with the clients as well.
Yeah, Alexandre, my experience was very particular because I was in charge of creating a ministry. So I began from scratch. You know, some social programs working here and there, coming together to build, to be working together within one new sector within the government was a major challenge, but it was also a great opportunity to test how our relationship with for example, IDB was really key to help that process. And I think the lesson learned from that experience is that you need an involvement throughout the process, not only coming with the right instrument in one moment or with the right loan for evaluation or for implementation or for technical assistance, but going together with the government through all the process. And that is long, is tedious at some moments, but that is what provides really a solid relationship that allows to take the better advantage of what Development Bank can offer. In the case of IDB and MIDIS, this was maybe a unique case because, you know, MIDIS, the Ministry of Development and Social Inclusion, didn't have any offices at the beginning. And we went to a lot of meetings in the IDB offices, so we called those offices the BDs. So just to ensure that it was a very strong relationship. But the key issue was that what you really need is full support throughout the process. And to really answer the needs that arise at each different moment in the creation of a program, the implementation of an intervention, the design of a new type of program, and that support has to be on time. You don't want to have the Development Bank bringing the best expert in the world 6 months later than when you really need it, because you don't have the time to wait for that. You will make decisions before. And then it won't help. So being there is the only way to really ensure that you can answer on time. And also show, as we need access to good evidence, the policymaker needs to have access to a toolbox that the development banks offer all the time. And knowing that toolbox is key. For example, we use a PBL as a way to ensure that if me or my team was not leading the sector 5 years or 3 years after, the Ministry of Economics and Finance will have all the incentives to ensure that the results that we said in our moment were achieved to obtain the money from the PBL. And that was key to get this sense of sustainability. So knowing the instruments, having all this tool set, and having the support throughout the process, timely, is the key.
Excellent. Carolina, I appreciate particularly your point on the role of PBLs helping this transition. Marie.
It was pretty effective.
Yes, I hope that we have board members around and hearing, listening to that. Marie, we are getting to our last few minutes. What is your recommendations for institutions like ours, you that work with development agencies and several MDBs, to foster this culture of collaboration and learning among ourselves?
Yeah, no, thanks. I think that it's interesting because we talk here about using evidence, but there is very little evidence on what works in institutionalizing evidence. And so I think this is one thing that, and as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of organizations like IDB, FCDO, NORAD, they're all trying out things. It's all slightly different. All the organizations are also slightly different, but there will be some lessons that can be shared and can be learned. But they should also be rigorously evaluated using the variety of tools that we have at hand. We can do quite rigorous evaluations. And so I think, once we are experimenting in this institutional space, it's incumbent upon us to also evaluate and share those lessons. And so that, I think, is one of the main purposes and objectives of this global evidence commitment that we're launching with President Goldfein and FCDO, NORAD, MCC, and KFW here on Friday. But really sort of, the idea being of holding each other to account, sharing lessons and holding each other to account. I think that's one particularly important area. The other is there is a lot of evidence. There are also a lot of evidence initiatives, and a bit back to what you mentioned, there's a lot of organizations that also do, and funders who actually want to own their own evidence commitments, as opposed to, joining funds in what is already there. So, and at a time when with scarce resources, just multiplying initiatives is not necessarily the best way to go. So coordinating some of this, I think, Ronald also talked about some of that kind of coordination. And then I really liked what you mentioned. I think we keep forgetting that development effectiveness actually happens in the countries. It doesn't happen in IDB. It doesn't happen, I mean, it's supposed to contribute to it, but where it happens is on the ground in the countries. And so, really, how do we have better conversations and ongoing support and dialogue in the countries, and using that whole toolbox? I fully agree. How do we do that better and adapt and learn as we go? Make it easy for team leaders to adapt. Making that the easy and default, rather than sort of having to go to huge reorganizational bureaucratic steps, etc. And so I think that and really having, finding a way, building up the countries to hold the institutions to account. I think that is one of the things that MCC actually has been quite effective at, is actually telling Congress, please hold us to account to this policy commitment. And they got in CGD to do so as well. So really build up your own accountability system. I think is something I would, think should be important. And then, again, back to the incentives. I really think, and Ronald, I think, Reid as well, I think that this is often the hardest part. Every time you want to fix something, you make a new requirement, a new procedure, and it's not alone, it's not going to work. So daring to take some big steps in terms of incentivizing this changed culture, I think will be, and again, learning how to do that among the MDBs, I think I would recommend strongly.
Excellent. We are already over time, so I won't be able to do justice to all the richness of the conversation that we had here. I just want to, but was extremely valuable, certainly for us, in the moment that we are revisiting our development effectiveness framework, in the moment where we are putting impact as front and center to our new institutional strategy. And for that, I want to thank Carolina, Marie, and Sir Ronald very, very much for your participation. Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's extend heartfelt thank you for all our esteemed panelists. Thank you very, very much. Your insights have highlighted a crucial aspect of promoting development effectiveness. It's not just about achieving objectives, but rather the harmonious integration of various components, paving the way for genuine, sustainable, and effective progress.